We're good to go. Thank you. Jenny, you're up.
Okay, all right. Well, David, thank you so much for doing this presentation this evening. I'm Jenny Cole from the Charlotte Library, and my husband Dan is here. He's president of the Charlotte Historical Society. David contacted us last spring looking for information for his soon-to-be published book about the Holmes family and farm in this area and in Charlotte. And even right from the start, seeing his early draft, it looked like he was going to have some really good information for our town history, and some very important information about farming and the difficulties of farming, and insights into what it is to be a Vermonter. I won't take up any more time this evening, but just really look forward to your slides and information tonight, David. Thank you again.
First of all, I do want to thank you, Jenny and Dan, who pay such terrific attention to Charlotte's history, and they're building archives and collections that are really important in understanding the history of this wonderful town called Charlotte. So I'm very, very grateful. I think there are about 52 people joining us tonight, and 51 are relatives. Now, that's an exaggeration, but an interesting part of getting the word around about this book are connections that have been made, I've made, and they've been made with me, of relatives that I may never have known or have not seen for many, many years. We had a family reunion in 1974 in Charlotte, and some of the folks at that reunion I've not seen since. So this has been a wonderful kind of exercise as a reunion in a sense. So I'm really very grateful for that. But this book project goes back, about 40 years, but in a sense it goes back before that. When I was a kid, I frequently visited my grandparents in Middlebury, and my grandparents, my grandmother and my grandfather, their daughter Marion and their son John, my father, were all at the farm. And then in 1923, they moved off the farm, and that's really the story that I will tell tonight. But when I was living in Charlotte in the 1980s and working at UVM, I recalled that my grandparents had talked about what they called the old farm, and on occasion drove by the old farm with my grandparents and saw the wonderful, beautiful covered bridge down by the Charlotte beach. And they kind of pointed up at this land south of the bridge and said, that's the old farm. And that's about all I thought about it as a kid. But when I came back in the 80s and began to think about it more and chatted with my wonderful Aunt Marion, who grew up on the farm, I began to get very interested in the story of the farm. And the curious part for me was that the family had to leave the farm in 1923. It was foreclosed on. And what I discovered in the course of doing the research, or concluded, is that was a calamity for the farm. It had been in existence for 101 years, and then it was gone. And then there was what I call the diaspora of the family moving ultimately or quickly to Middlebury. But in the 80s, with my curiosity, one day I wandered into special collections at the UVM library and asked the librarian, is there anything about apple orchards in Vermont that goes back to the 1800s? And she pointed me to a collection of volumes from the Vermont State Horticultural Society. And I went over and kind of thumbed through those volumes. And to my astonishment, I saw a large number of entries about the Holmes orchard in Charlotte, in particular testimony, verbatim testimony and commentary by my great-grandfather, C.T. Holmes. And that really got me going in the direction of wanting to learn more about the farm, and particularly the highly esteemed apple orchard. But I benefited also from the fact that my grandparents and my aunt had kept many of the old documents from the farm after 1923. There were probably about 120 pictures from that earlier era. There was an abundance of letters going back to the 1880s, and there were some wonderful, wonderful documents. So that gave me kind of a running start. And then my wife and I and two boys moved away in 1987, and we came back 4 years ago. And I decided to resume the project and learn as much as I could about the farm, the history of the farm, for a couple of reasons. One, I understood absolutely that a farm such as this was indicative of Vermont agriculture in apple orchards and raising horses over a great number of years. But it was really more personal than that. I wanted a sense of what was it like to be on a farm such as this back in the 1800s, and what was my family all about. So I prepared a manuscript, developed drafts, and went up to the Center for Research on Vermont, and they exhibited. Richard Watts, the director, said, "This sounds like a great story. We'd like to publish it," and that's really what got me going. And here, finally, is a book that's been published. It hit the streets about 3 weeks ago. And now I'm going to move to the next slide. But let me just briefly speak to the trajectory of this particular family. And the Holmeses, like so many other folks, left England and came to the New World in the 1600s. In this particular case, the Holmeses came in 1643 to Connecticut. They probably left for a couple of reasons. One, they worshipped as Quakers, and they were looking for a semblance of religious freedom, and also probably for economic opportunity. In the course of the next 100 years or so, they lived in various locations in Connecticut. And finally, in the middle 1700s, they settled in the Quaker community of Nine Partners, New York, north of New York City. And then they felt the aspiration of moving north and acquiring land, like so many, thousands of Americans did at the time. And in 1778, Nicholas Holmes bought land from the family of his wife, Phoebe. And then in 1788, Nicholas and his two sons, Jonathan and the second Nicholas, headed out in March of 1788 to this property in Moncton, Vermont. And the typical trajectory or pattern of moving north in those days was to waiting until March, where the rivers were still frozen and you could transport, in this particular case, up Otter Creek, as you know, stretches from southern Vermont all the way into Lake Champlain and Vergennes and Ferrisburgh, and then on the ice, if need be, to Burlington, et cetera. But they came on the ice on Otter Creek and made their way to Moncton in 1788. And they farmed there. There was a family of three men. There was Nicholas and his sons, Jonathan and Nicholas, another Nicholas. And the younger Nicholas in 1822 was looking to break away from the family. And he moved with his wife and son, Jonathan, to Charlotte on the lake in 1822. It was, as a matter of fact, it was the land exchange, and it was a major move away from the family, but headed to that location and build a farm. 101 years later, the farm was foreclosed on by a Burlington bank, and they left and moved to Middlebury. And a piece of this story, of this trajectory, was the redirection and the resuscitation of the family after 1923. But let me just, if you're not familiar with this part of Charlotte, let me just show you this map. And many of you know where the Charlotte Beach is, and you know where Hills Point Road is, or River Road. And you see the road coming up to what is called the residence of John Holmes. Then it runs along the lake where we now have the Charlotte Beach, and then the Hill Homestead. The Hills were the first occupants of that part of Charlotte at that point in the 1700s and then the early 1800s. So hopefully that situates you. And if you look at the map, you see Holmes Creek, what became known as Holmes Creek, spilling into the lake. And that's the location of that utterly beautiful covered bridge, now called the Holmes Covered Bridge. And the land to the south of there was the 200 or so acres of the Holmes farm. But it was indeed a farm, and all the things that you can all imagine having to do with nurturing and growing a farm, sheep and cows and oxen and hay and manure and chickens and so on. So it was first and foremost a farm. But they discovered very quickly when they got to this location that there was some clay down just south of what we now know as the covered bridge. It was ideal for brick making. So they created very quickly kind of a side business with a brickyard. And this is the first house built on the property, the Holmes house, with the bricks from the brickyard. And you see one of my relatives standing on the front porch. I will tell you that this was a house that was torn down probably 60 or 70 years later. And then when the Thurbers came into possession of the property, Sky Thurber, as a matter of fact, right on this site, had a house. And if any of you were around a couple of weeks ago, Sky has now moved away, and that house was burned down by the Charlotte Fire Department so that a new house could be built there. But the brickyard was a business. A passion for the family, like so many, many Vermonters, was horses, and the family loved the Morgan horse. And I'll speak to this in a little bit. But here's a relative standing with great pride with two utterly beautiful horses, and the horses became a business for the family. Then, of course, there were the apples, and they ultimately grew an apple orchard that became reputedly the largest one in New England for a period of time. And it became, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, frankly, the largest source of income for the family. And I'll speak a little bit more in depth with some pictures about the apple orchard in a second. But let's not forget that there were indigenous populations in Vermont and all over our nation for a long period of time. These are arrowheads that have been collected near the lake and elsewhere in Charlotte. And Dan Cole, nicely, and thank you, Dan, showed me this collection of arrowheads. And these are arrowheads that were collected, many of which near the property where the Holmeses eventually built their farm. But let's never forget the indigenous populations that are so much a part of the long history of Vermont. But let me just mention what I would call some elements of the story that I think are maybe useful to remember. First of all, in my research, it has shown that this is really the only case study, what I would call a case study of a Vermont farm that stretches from the early 1800s to the early 1900s. There are other case studies of Vermont farms of more recent vintage, but I'm hoping as a scholar that the book makes a contribution to the literature about early Vermont farms. And then secondly, I've had to ask the question, is this a story really of just one family, and is there significance beyond that? And I really believe that the history of this farm over 101 years is representative of many, many patterns, and it's a slice of Vermont history. It's both the settling of Vermont in the late 1700s into the 1800s. It's the building of farms in some very tough terrain, as we well know, over a number of years. And then the pattern of what the tough, gritty Vermont farmers had to deal with over, frankly, over a lifetime. But it is in fact a family history. It's a local history. And I believe very strongly that family histories and local histories collected in a common geography are very important. It's very important to understanding who we are. And it has communal value, I believe, particularly at a point as you all know, in the history of our country, where there's so much division and kind of struggling to understand who we are as a people. Then a piece of this, of course, thinking as an academician, is the challenge of balancing what I would call a scholarly study with my DNA. I'm connected by family to this story. So it's an interesting balancing act to write a book that is so close to one's own history and make a contribution in terms of a story of Vermont farming. And then a piece of the story is, and we all know this, if you live long enough anywhere, but you live long enough in Vermont, ultimately there are Vermont families that are joined. And I can tell you that over the 100 years or so, that there's been a joining, in particular of John's family, which settled Huntington in 1786. G. Hall Johns is kind of a legendary figure in the settling of Vermont, and there's a great literature about the Johns family and the settling of Huntington. Then the Ross family, who came also to Huntington, and over the succeeding many years, the Johnses and the Rosses and the Holmeses were connected by marriage. And for me, that's very meaningful. And then I guess the most personal side of this story is coming back to Vermont about 4 years ago and wondering, am I a Vermonter? I've been away for 30 years, and what does it mean to be a Vermonter? And am I a true Vermonter? I'll speak to that in a little bit, but that was kind of the introspection that was a part of this project. Let me say a little bit about the property itself and situate all of you on this map. And I'll tell you, this is a map that I drew from a sketch that my Aunt Marion Holmes drew for me back in the 1980s. And it was from her memory of growing up on the farm until she left at about age 11. But if you look at the map, you'll see on the upper right-hand side, with the location of the covered bridge, if that situates you. And then of course, Lake Champlain to the west, and then the property moves in a west and southerly direction from the bridge. So what we see at the top of this map is pasture land, and then to the west of that, a large property for the apple orchard. And then that brick house that I told you is what I would call house number one. And then moving south, there was a blacksmith shop. There was a storage area for all kinds of things, including what has been grown, a chicken house, and then a corn crib, which is certainly a part of the farm. And then below that, an apple shed and a machine shop. And I'll speak a little bit to what about that machine shop in a little bit. An ice house, another house, which is a house that was built by my grandfather when he married in 1911 to Rena Johns. A pump house. They were one of the first farms in Vermont to pump water from Lake Champlain to irrigate irrigate their crops, and in particular the apple orchard. Worker housing, another section of apple orchard, another pump house, and then you see a third house, a horse barn, a sheep barn, all the things you would expect on a farm. More pasture land, and then a racetrack, a half-mile racetrack, which as you could guess was connected to raising horses and racing horses. And at the bottom, a burial ground, which I puzzled over for a long period of time, and I'll speak to that in just a second. But that's the property. But as I said, it's connected to my DNA, and I came across this picture, and standing in the middle was the kind of the boss of the farm for a long period of years, my great-grandfather, C.T. Holmes. To his right is my grandfather, Robert Holmes, and to his left is his brother, William Holmes. When I showed this picture to one of my sons, they looked at C.T. Holmes and said, that's kind of a cool guy. Look at the way he's standing. Look at that kind of neat little mustache, then the hatchet there and his crossed legs, and kind of a neat guy. But part of my DNA. I should tell you that William Holmes ultimately moved to Proctor to work there, and they had 7 children, and they got to a point in the history of the farm where The farm just could not sustain all of the families, and all of the children were there. So William and his wife moved to Proctor, and he began work in the Proctor marble quarries. And this is a picture that really that strikes me. There's C.T. Holmes again to the right, my grandfather to the left. And this is such a classic scene of dinner at noontime. You know, they were up early, they had breakfast, they had a mid-morning snack, and then they take a break at noon, and they have the largest meal of the day at noon at dinner. And when I look at the smiles on their faces after a morning of physical exercise, I feel like I could just step into this picture. I love this picture. And then I mentioned something about the burial ground, and thanks to Mr. Allen, who lives today just south of the property, and frankly, just east of what I showed as the burial ground on that map. This is the last headstone up in that burial ground. And it's the headstone of Nicholas, who came with his wife and his son Jonathan in 1822 to the new farm. And one might ask, who was buried there and where are all the headstones? Well, as it turns out, I puzzled over that. And then with some further research and help from Charlotte residents, what I realized was when the farm failed in 1923, they basically picked up the headstones, the caskets, and the bones and moved them to the cemetery behind the Charlotte Congregational Church. Now, why did that happen? First, over time, although the family worshiped as Quakers and went to the meeting house in Ferrisburg, over time they began to gravitate in the direction of the Charlotte Congregational Church. But the point is, when they left the farm and it was foreclosed on, they didn't leave their dead behind. But this beautiful large headstone is still in the ground and probably still there because it was so large and so heavy. But that was kind of a subplot that I had to kind of figure out. Well, what are the kinds of things that I learned, at least, from studying the farm? First of all, and this is very much like farmers all over Vermont, there was a true entrepreneurial spirit and a readiness to diversify. And I've mentioned both the brickyard, I mentioned the horse business, and I mentioned apples. So in a certain sense, this was a survival instinct on the part of the family, but also reflected, I think, great passion and creativity around things that they loved, such as horses. Then, of course, a piece of this story is the reality of a multi-generational enterprise that lived for over 101 years. And I think that's typical of so many Vermont farms over so many years. And then also ultimately when farms and families ran up against obstacles that they simply couldn't overcome. I can tell you one of the leading scholars in the world about multi-generational businesses are the Sharmas at the University of Vermont Business School. And I was able to consult with them and get a perspective on how a multi-generational enterprise or farm could survive over 101 years. And then of course, like so many farms all over, you rely tremendously on borrowing money. And of course, the income from the selling of products and other sorts of things. So at the end of this story, the family was very dependent on borrowing money. And that became, frankly, the problem that led to the failing of the farm and ultimately foreclosure in 1920 and 1923. But I think a piece of this story and so many others, after foreclosure and the calamity of losing the farm, the family displayed phenomenal resilience, strength of character, and rebuilding the farm. A part of the story of this farm and so many others in Vermont was a kind of a tacit aspiration for education. And I can tell you there was a study by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching contracted by the Vermont Department of Education to study Vermont education. I'll speak to that in a second, but one of the things they discovered was that in 1914 and during that era, Vermont had the largest percentage of young people actually attending school of any state in the country. And they also had the 5th highest attendance of any state in the country in terms of children showing up every day for school. So this tacit aspiration for education is, I think, is very true of Vermont, and those of you and others that know this history can certainly speak to that. But I mentioned something about the entrepreneurial instinct. This is a patent that C.T. Holmes acquired for a pruning saw, a pruning device consisting of a handle and a saw blade, etc. He got a patent for this that he had invented in dealing with the issues of trimming trees. I don't know. I know he took it to market, but I don't know how lucrative it was. But it's part of this entrepreneurial creative instinct that I think every farmer has. And I spoke about the breeding, racing, and selling of Morgan horses, where they built the business, and this is their first catalog in 1885, called the Apple Tree Farm. And it featured 8 or 10 horses for sale. And I can tell you that they made sales as far away as Madison Square Garden in New York and in South America. So they built a very first-rate horse farm focused on Morgan horses. But let me say something about horses. I guess every Vermonter who grew up in the 1700s, the 1800s, had a horse, knew how to ride a horse. And in Charlotte, every weekend, it was race day. They had 2 very highly attended racetracks in Charlotte, one on the side of East Charlotte, and this is the race day in West Charlotte. And you see the vehicles lined up there. Horse racing in Charlotte during this era was rather crazy, and there really wasn't the starting gates you'd find down at Saratoga. So the horses, the 6 or 7 horses, would mill around, and then somebody would blow a horn and they'd head off. And frequently it was a wild and unsuccessful start, and they sometimes had to start 2 or 3 times. The other thing I would say is that what this was is what we know as harness racing, but what they knew in that day is pulling a cart. So that was the kind of racing that took place in Charlotte, at county fairs all over Vermont and all over New England. And my great-grandfather, C.T. Holmes, his son Robert, and Charles Johns, who was connected to the family by marriage, they raced at fairs all over Vermont and throughout New England, and made I would suppose, a modest amount of income from doing that. But the basic point is that they were just passionate about Morgan horses and passionate about racing them. But then, of course, there is the orchard, and this is a beautiful spring day, and the orchard is in bloom. What I would tell you quickly about the history of apple orchards in Vermont, there were really basically 3 chapters. There was the cider era, which began in the early 1800s into about the 1870s. And cider, for years and years, is probably the safest thing to drink. And but Vermonters, being ingenious as they were, they learned how to make hard cider and blackjack. And so there was at one point, there were 120 distilleries in the state of Vermont to develop blackjack. And over the period of time, people began to fight that. And, we had prohibition come to Vermont and come throughout the nation. And then the so-called family era of orchards began roughly about 1875 to about 1910. Then the commercial era of Vermont orchards was 1910 and after. The Holmes farm spanned all 3 eras. The orchard was planted by Jonathan Holmes in 1862, and then it proceeded from there and grew in its economic impact and became a major part of the history of the family. A part of growing apples, of course, is getting them to market. And I mentioned the machine shop. at the farm. They built literally hundreds and hundreds of stave barrels in which to pack the apples. And it was the stave barrels that were used for shipping the apples in every direction. The family had a dock off the north shore, and they shipped apples south through Lake Champlain and ultimately onto New York. And they shipped them north through Lake Champlain to the St. Lawrence, and they had an agent in London to buy those apples. So the stave barrels were important auxiliary, frankly, of the apple business. And one question was that I thought about: did they buy the barrels or not? Well, they built the barrels, and interestingly, they had instruction from the Vermont Railroad in terms of loading the barrels, very explicit instructions how you would load perhaps 100 barrels on a train car. And the reason that was so important, of course, was to get apples that were unimpaired, uninjured to market. And I mentioned education, and this was the era of the 1800s of the one-room schoolhouse, and Charlotte had many one-room schoolhouses. This is the so-called brick schoolhouse that was hopefully you can hear me now. This is the schoolhouse, and my grandfather and a cousin of his are seated in front of this good old building, brick schoolhouse. It probably was built with apples with bricks from the Holmes farm. And all the Holmeses got educated. One branch of the family would go to Ferrisburg. There was this house, and then there was a Lakeview Seminary that many of you know at the connection of Ferry Road near the old brick store. And there's a great story that goes along with that, which many of you know, but the great philosopher John Dewey taught for one winter at the Lakeview Seminary in the 1800s. And he was a frail man, but brilliant, went on to be a world figure. But the story is that the farm boys of Charlotte were kind of rough hewn, and that was not a marriage that was going to last for long. And then, of course, this is something you all know, but ice was utterly critical to the success and longevity of a farm for preserving produce in particular. And this was an era before climate change, right, where the lake basically froze over north to south every winter. And this is the getting ice, retrieving ice from Lake Champlain from Hills Bay, which had its own very specific kinds of procedures. And there were two ice houses on the farm, and they collected ice, and a really important part of the life of the farm. Then, of course, it wasn't all hard work, and it wasn't all fighting off winter weather. Vermonters, particularly on Sundays, knew how to enjoy life. This happens to be C.T. Holmes playing croquet, but in the winter they skated. The children had buggies. They learned how to do horses, and then ride horses and move a buggy. And there was a point at which my great-grandfather taught my grandfather how to use barrel staves as skis. And so they had very rudimentary skis on their slight hills at the farm where they learned to ski. And my grandfather's two children, my father and his aunt, learned to ski. And I'll mention in a second how skiing became a really important part of the life of the family once they moved off the farm. But ultimately, the farm failed. And you perhaps know this era of history, but there was the First World War, which was disruptive in many, many ways. There was a Spanish flu, which had a devastating impact worldwide, but certainly did in Vermont. Hundreds and hundreds of Vermonters died from the Spanish flu, not unlike this time of COVID. And then, unfortunately, there were a great number of years of very dry years in Vermont. And ultimately, the the family could not keep up its mortgage payments. And I guess it was an era in Vermont banking that there wasn't a lot of room for negotiation. Missed a couple payments and the bank foreclosed on the family. And then in the spring of 1923, the family got off the farm. And this was the notice of foreclosure. And let me just, as an aside, say that it's absolutely wonderful, going back to the 1700s, that in the town clerk's office in Charlotte, every single deed and every grand list is collected up on a high shelf in the town clerk's office in Charlotte. So I was able to track all 33 land transactions over the history of the farm. I was able to find the deed for buying the farm. And then, I guess in a sense, unhappily, the end game when the farm was foreclosed on. But a piece of the story I'd like to mention is that in 1968, there was a serious proposal to build a nuclear plant on the property just south of the covered bridge. And the Thurber family, who had come into ownership of the farm in the 1930s, were struggling to make the farm survive. And this was a time in which farmland was kind of looked at and taxed for its developmental potential long before legislation provided a break for those of us that work the land. So there was a serious proposal by the Vermont Public Service Corporation in contract with the Thurber family to build a nuclear plant. And slowly but surely, it began to develop real opposition in the town of Charlotte. There were town meetings in 1968. In fact, there was a meeting in Patrick Gym at the University of Vermont in 1968 in which representatives of the Atomic Energy Commission and Senator George Aiken and all sides of the issue met. But ultimately, they had a survey in the town of Charlotte, and by roughly 3-1, the citizens of Charlotte did not want a nuclear plant in this beautiful part of Vermont and beautiful part of Charlotte, so that it never was built. But sometimes the most important things in life are the things that don't happen. So just think of the impact that it would have had. And here's a picture that I took last year of roughly where the nuclear plant would be, looking west towards the beautiful Adirondacks of New York. And to the left side of this picture is the point in which the farm existed for those 101 years. And you see out in the middle of this picture, the location of the old apple dock. It's now been reconstructed by succeeding people on the land. And as you might guess, like so much of Vermont, particularly along the lake, residential houses have been built. It's been gentrified over the last 50 or 60 years, and that was the ultimate fate of the farmland. But I think I said earlier, I kind of asked myself the existential question: am I a real Vermonter? I was born in Rutland, moved away at 3 months with my family, came back attended Middlebury College for 4 years, came back to worked at UVM for 13 years, and went away until we came back 4 years ago. When I looked at and pondered all of this, I looked at the history of the farm, what the clues were in the life of that farm around the character of the people that lived there. And I think it's fair to say these were people with a great moral foundation, were religious, were Quakers, attended the church in Charlotte. There were people with resilience and grit and perseverance. And to me, that says something about all Vermonters. I also looked at what many people have said over many years about what it means to be a Vermonter. Most of the literature that if you find about what it means to be a Vermonter is kind of humorous in nature and not particularly helpful, but there were some very thoughtful observations about what it means to be a Vermonter that I had a chance to look at. Then, of course, I looked at my own experience. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, two things that occurred to in my own life, I guess shaped what I think about myself and being a Vermonter. One, I bought a 150-acre farm up in Moortown on the other side of the Green Mountains, and had that for a number of years, and met the residents there. Ultimately, other members of my family bought property there, and I married a Vermonter, and I think that makes some difference, certainly, in who I think I am and whether or not I believe I'm a Vermonter. But in thinking about all of this, what does it mean to be a Vermonter in 2021? And are there characteristics or factors that hold true through all of these years? And ultimately in the book, after looking at all this evidence, I came up with a single sentence that I believe describes a Vermonter. Trying to get this, okay. Vermonters are hardworking, resilient people who care about others and their community, have a sound moral foundation, work hard, know a lot, prefer things on a small scale, love the outdoors and beauty of their state, and find humor in life's absurdities. I love a Vermont humor. It's a low key. You have to listen for it. It's not a knee-slapping humor, but as we all walk around in a daily way and talk to Vermonters, there's just that twinkle in the eye. And I think that's part of what defines a Vermonter. And I must say, I'm very proud to have been born here, be back in Vermont, and consider myself a Vermonter, and to be living with so many of you that are on this Zoom call. So with that, let me just say something about the book. If you have an interest in getting the book, the Vermont Bookshop has been very helpful, and that's one of the faster ways to get the book. You can go to their website and you can order it online, and they can order it for you. Amazon is equally, maybe even faster. You get the book on Amazon and they will put the order in, and they go right to, and they will print 1 or 2 books at a time. And then it's now being reprinted already, and in due course, I will have copies for sale, or we will, at the Charlotte Library at Horsford's, where Charlie Prout and I have been talking, and then also the Old Brick Store for sale. But there's a new printing in process, and I've been really gratified by the interest of so many people in our local history, and the history and the love we have for Charlotte and all of Vermont. So thank you for your interest in this story, and I think I'll turn back to Susanna, who may have I think found there's some questions or comments, and I would be glad to comment and respond.
Yes, so just 1 second. I'm having a little technical difficulty here with my computer froze. So I'm on a different computer and I don't have all the chat questions. I can ask the current ones, and then maybe I'll have Jenny look in the chat for the other ones. The first question is, please remind me what the title of your book is.
It's called On Being a Vermonter and the Rise and Fall of the Holmes Farm, 1822 to 1923. And it's published by the Center for Research on Vermont, which is based at UVM, and also the White River Press. But there's the book.
Great.
And it's now being reprinted.
And then Susan asks, have you seen the giant boulder on the beach toward the south end of the property that has the name Holmes chiseled into it? I rented the big house from Sky Thurber for a year in the early 90s. Are there any farm buildings left on the property besides the sheep barn?
Well, first of all, I haven't seen that large boulder, and I must say I'm a little bit, I go onto the property, it's private property, and I've nosed around and haven't been thrown off the property yet, but I haven't seen that large boulder. Yeah, a couple of the buildings that come down the road to the south, I think have been saved and renovated, particularly there was some worker housing down there, and there was some storage areas. And I think those probably the only two buildings that still exist on the site. The rest of them have been taken down or fallen down one way or another over the years. So it really takes these old pictures and imagination to get a sense of what it looked like in 1880. That's where the pictures come in.
Okay, thank you. And then Jenny, maybe can you jump in on those other questions before 7:47 when my screen blanked out?
Let me see if I can find them. Let's see here.
Well, you know, Jenny, while you're doing that, I would say to the folks that are here this evening, anybody who would like to have a conversation about all of this, please feel free to email me, and I'd love to be in conversation. And already, as I said earlier, there are a number of relatives that I've had the great pleasure to interact with that has been just a lot of fun. I've learned a lot. But my email, if I could give it to you, is David R. Holmes 24@gmail.com. So I certainly would invite any kind of discussion as all of us better understand what the past was all about.
Okay, I put that in the chat. Jenny, are you, go ahead.
Yeah, so you said after 7:45.
Before, everything before that disappeared on me. And there's a couple that are coming in
Okay,
now.
so you did remind me of the book title, The Giant Boulder.
So the things above that, are there any questions above that?
There are some of the, I think, earlier communications about family connections. Let me see. I'll go back to them and just go over them. There was a good evening from Jean McDurphy and a hello from Beth Taylor. The message from Steve McDurphy, great-grandson of William Hazard Holmes, who was the brother of your great-grandpa Charles Titus Holmes. I'm a message from Nancy Townsend saying, I'm Steve's sister, also related. From Peter Holmes, Peter Holmes, also great-grandson of William Holmes, William H.H. Holmes. Let me see, and Connie Marion says, I'm Connie Marion, also related. From Jean McDurphy, Harriet Holmes' granddaughter. Hey, cousin Connie and cousin Cindy.
Well, Jenny, if you could keep I think you can keep what appears on chat, because I'd love to see that afterwards. Thank you.
Okay.
And there have been some more questions that have come in since then. So let's see. How about, did you come across the name of Harriet Holmes in the process of your writing? Asked Ruth Durfee.
I didn't, and I had to make some choices in terms of the family tree, and I knew, of course, there's a branch of Holmeses that were settled in New York State that ultimately ended up in New York State with a lot of intermarriage, and I knew about them from our reunion back in 1974. But I simply had to make, I guess, the writer's choice of focusing on the most immediate Holmes clan, which came to Middlebury after the foreclosure on the farm, and kind of kept it, had to keep it somewhat narrow. But one of the things that may grow out of this would be perhaps another family reunion that draws us all together from all over one more time, at least.
Okay, and then Steve Durfee asked, I find it interesting that John's son, CT, Connecticut, stayed on the farm, and William, the eldest son usually gets the farm. Any insights why he left and not his brother?
that is a really good question, because there were two instances of Jonathan, who succeeded his father Nicholas and basically being the head of family for the farm, was the younger of two brothers. And likewise, CT was younger than William. And so I pondered that a lot, and I didn't quite figure it out. But what I do know is that Charles Titus Holmes was a charismatic person who had passion for the horses and the apples, and he became quite prominent in Vermont. And I think his energy and his leadership it evolved over time that he would become the lead Holmes on the farm. But there may well have been a lot more to that than I know. But what I do know is that William and CT, the two branches of the family, they get together frequently, over Christmas and 4th of July, and the Holmes family in Charlotte went to Proctor and vice versa, and they had family reunions. So if there was some conflict or bitterness that came out of that dynamic, I think they dealt with it in a pretty healthy and positive way. But it was, from this many years later, I just couldn't quite get a handle on the dynamic that led to two younger sons becoming the lead figures in the farm. But a great question.
And Steve also says, we found the record of Harriet's birth in the Charlotte Town Hall. She was actually named Hattie Holmes at birth.
Oh, really? Yeah, I've seen Hattie in some of the documents, that name Hattie, some of the documents I've seen.
And then you sort of addressed this. Peter Holmes says, time for another reunion of Holmes, Ross, Johns et al.
Yeah, I was just speaking with my sister, who, by the way, the house that they moved to in 1923 at 54 High Street, still in the family. And my sister and her husband are renovating that house. And that was a house that was built in the early 1800s. Anyway, my sister Carol and I were speaking earlier this week about maybe it is time for another reunion. So that would be, she said, 26, 36, 47 years later, I think it may be time for a reunion. But I really do believe, as I said earlier, that understanding one's roots in local history, and I know this from being an educator and working with young people throughout my career, kind of in this time of social media, gives a kind of a root identity for our young people. And I think understanding our family roots is something that is really important for all of us, but particularly for our younger generations. And that in itself, I think, would be a reason to have a reunion. So perhaps coming out of this evening, all those relatives that appeared on the Zoom call, we'll get our act together and maybe aim for a reunion next summer.
Okay, and then we have several more questions. Do you have the date of birth of Hattie Holmes or know who she married?
I don't have that, and it's probably in a family tree in a carton down in my basement here in Panton that could be recovered. And but I think that there is some really wonderful work on family trees done by Harley Allen, actually over many years, a resident of Charlotte, that has a lot of that information that I think together we could dig into that and reconstruct many of these connections.
And actually, I'm seeing later on in the chat, someone says it's date of birth of Hattie Holmes is May 8th, 1885. And then we have were there migrant apple pickers who came for the harvest? Where did they come from?
That is an excellent question. And in the book, there are several pictures of the pickers, and there would be 100 or more folks coming temporarily to the to the property and to the apple orchard. And I think they came from, it was a period of time in the early 1900s where there was I forgot the phrase, but there was a resentment from immigrants from other countries. So I have just from what I can tell, most of the pickers who came for temporary work were, Americans that had been living here for a number of years, but may not have been particularly wealthy economically and needed the money to come and pick. And they'd come for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, and they would live at the farm. And there were 5 meals a day, as I implied earlier. There was breakfast, midday, mid-morning, lunch, mid-afternoon, and the evening dinner. And there were relatives that came from all around that helped support the pickers. And in the book, for those of you that have it, will see it, there was a really interesting incident that happened, I think in about 1912, where some of the pickers had gotten drunk. C.T. Holmes fired them. The next morning they came in and wreaked havoc on the house. C.T. called the police. The pickers went and hopped a train, and the police met them at the Shelburne station and arrested them. And this was all written up in a major headline in the Burlington Free Press. So it was a lawless moment at the apple orchard back in the early 1900s. The other thing that I looked at, and there's some really important work that was done about the so-called hill section of Heinsberg, in which 20 or 25 African Americans lived for a number of years. And there are indications, when I look at the pictures of the apple pickers, that there were 2 or 3 African Americans, 2 or 3 blacks that were a part of the group, and they may well have been connected to the so-called hill in Heinsberg, which for me is a really important finding about the history of Vermont.
So we have a bunch of people saying very nice things. So thank you for your presentation. So I'm going to read the ones that have questions or other things. Like Francis Foster says, David, my late husband, Will Foster, was the developer, of the property. He bought it from the Thurbers in 1976, I think. He always told me that the Thurbers' son-in-law worked for the power company and convinced the Thurbers that nuclear power was the best type of power at the time and a great use for the property.
Yeah, I knew both of those things. And I know the Fosters. When we lived, Jim Foster was a great friend, and his wife, were great friends of ours. And I kind of knew the Fosters were involved in, developing the property. So that it's an utterly beautiful place to live today.
Ed asks, how many people worked on the farm during the heyday? How many apples were harvested yearly?
Well, I've got that figure. I got those figures in the book in terms of the number of barrels that were sold and at what price, over the years. I really don't have them off the top of my head. But by and large, it was the family that ran the farm and nurtured the apple orchard I was aware of at least one hired man who was there for a number of years. But other than the apple picking time, it was really the family and the extended family that supported the farm and all the activities of the farm. And that was pretty much the way, I think most farms survived over, years and years, 150 years. There were hired men, but very few, because you'd have to pay them.
So Kathleen says, my mother's Quaker family were among the founders of Nine Partners School. They were into the fruit business. Mother said her father raised every kind of fruit except citrus. Grandpa Haight had a bunkhouse for 40 apple pickers. He went to Buffalo City streets to hire them.
No, that is very fascinating, and I've wanted to visit Nine Partners, and I'll mention something that is pretty typical of New England back in the 17 or 1800s. I found in some records from Nine Partners that the Holmes family provided manumission of a young black boy who was a slave at the time. And of course, that was kind of a horrifying thing for me to come across that document that goes back to Nine Partners. But I think, as we all know from research over the last 15 or 20 years, we think of the South as being the location of this horrendous practice of slavery, but New England was certainly a part of that picture for a long period of time. And then I asked myself, what does it say about the family? Well, they had an act of manumission of this young boy at I think it was age 5, and they moved to Charlotte near Ferrisburg, and the Robinson family, which by the way was connected to the Holmes family, they knew each other and went to the meeting house together, was one of the really important stops on the Underground Railroad. And then at one point early on, the Charlotte Congregational Church married a Black couple. So this part of Vermont was very active in abolition during the early 1800s, which made me feel better about that document I found from 9 partners.
Oops, there seems to be an echo, sorry. So I'm going to read the questions that are left now. If people have more questions after this, please email David, because I think we could be here all night talking about Charlotte history. So Deirdre Holmes says, I am also a Holmes, but not a relation. I live in a farmhouse from 1850 and would love to know more about the history of the farm. Can you recommend best ways to study the history of farms and farmhouses in town?
Can I recommend some sources? Yeah, I don't have them off the tip of my tongue, but there are some sources about the architecture and old farmhouses. I could find those, and then Jenny may know, at the Charlotte Library there, and you may know there's some sources about the early history of farms. Back at the bicentennial, there were wonderful local histories that were written. There's a Charlotte history, a Heinsberg history, and a Huntington history that I relied on, and citizens of these towns wrote some wonderful history. They're called I think one of the book is called Looking Around Charlotte, and you'll find there's some pictures of the old buildings and the early history, and that work was very, very helpful, and it was really research from the grassroots of people who lived in our small towns.
And some people might have missed that at the beginning. Jenny talked about how David came into the library to get some help in some of the research, and there are a lot of local history resources at the library. Jenny, did you want to say something about that?
I was just going to say the same thing, that that's people often are looking for information about their properties, and we have some resources and people that can help her as well. And so anybody interested can contact the library, and also the town hall is another source to look in the town land records. We're always happy to get those questions at the library.
Yeah, and it's great. And Jenny, you have a little display, I think, that relates to the book now in the library.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, look, as you said, Susanna, we bursted through the 1 hour mark. So maybe we've got our close here, and any questions that come to you or me along the way, or any interaction, I would be very enthusiastic about that. But thank you all. Thank Jenny and Susanna. Thank you so much for hosting this, and thanks to all of you for listening and being a part of this discussion. This is exciting for me, and I'm very grateful.
Oh, good. So in the chat is David's email. It's davidrholmes24@gmail.com, and I will save the chat so that we can make sure that your questions are answered. So maybe when everyone else leaves, Jenny, why don't you stay on so we can make sure that we're not missing any pieces of this from my frozen other screen here. And thank you everyone for your patience, and thank you so much, David, for being with us tonight.
No, thank you. Thank you all. I much enjoyed this.
Okay, so Jenny. Jenny, you might be able to save the chat. Let's see.
All right.
I think it's recorded already. It just makes me nervous not to save it a second way.
Okay, let me see.
Okay, I'll get off this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again, David. That was great.
I
Really
hope it-
appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Bye.
Bye. All right, so saving the chat. Let's see.
I can, let me also go into my Zoom controls and see where. I can just make sure that it's saved on. Just 1 second. I can double check that it was saved in the recording part
Okay.
while we. So if someone's there and wondering about hearing the recording, yes, I will put the recording up on the website in the next few days. It'll be on the charlottepubliclibrary.org website. Hold on, Jenny. Thank you for your patience. It's weird. I used it. I'm going to stop the recording now. And you're gonna, yes.